Dr Haroon Sidat, welcome to In Good Faith.
Thank you.
It's an honor to have you here, and a bit surreal, really, because we were interacting quite a lot, quite a few years ago. Mm-hmm. Then it's been a long time since we've interacted at all.
Yep.
And then we've barely sort of exchanged any views or ideas before we've sat down here. So it's all gonna come out rather fresh. But yeah, no, definitely honored to have you here, down from up near Blackburn somewhere.
That's right. Thank you for having me here. It's wonderful to be here.
Great. And so you've done 2 undergraduate degrees, a master's degree, a PGCE, a PhD, and you're a research associate now, and you have been at Cardiff University for 10 years?
10 years or so, yes.
You're a trustee of Cambridge Muslim College.
Yes.
And what have I missed?
And that's about it, I think.
That's about it. So how have you retained your sense of humour through all of this?
I think when you're doing all this sort of work, it can be quite serious. And it's good to be serious and switched on. But I think sometimes you need to have a sense of humour, especially when you're trying to connect with people. People sometimes, I guess, when they approach you, because you have all these titles, you know who you really are. And so the titles can sometimes scare people, or can create distance. And so you want to break that distance. But I also think it's part of my own personal journey. Sometimes I found that people who are, let's say, very educated, they like to present themselves as sort of aloof from society. Mm-hmm. And personally, as a young man growing up in the UK, I've had a problem with that. I would like to think that people should be more approachable as they become more enlightened or more educated.
So you're a man of the people.
I try to be. Not a politician type man of the people, but I try to be, yeah.
Sure. So for someone who doesn't know you, but who's aware now that, you've gone through this long, extensive and quite diverse journey of study and learning, how would you summarize what the driving force behind that has been? What have you been trying to get to? What are you looking for?
Initially, my education was pushed by my father in particular. He felt the need for me to memorize the Quran. So you memorize the Quran, and also the broader culture of where I lived. Memorizing the Quran was something like a crowning achievement in many respects. And then I studied, obviously, a Darul Ulum curriculum, a traditional madrasa curriculum.
So this was in what's called a Darul Ulum in Blackburn,
or a seminary, if you like. Yeah, I mean, I studied in the Bury one.
Oh, in Bury, okay.
I studied in there too. I completed my hifz there. Mm-hmm. So I was there for 1 year, but I did what's called my Alamiya in Blackburn, Darul Ulum. And when I was there, I was fortunate enough to travel to the US, because in the US at the time, they were struggling to find people to lead Taraweeh, the Ramadan prayers. And so a friend of mine, we both traveled, and we were fortunate enough to meet a lovely gentleman who started sort of asking me questions. He was a doctor, I think. He was very, very well educated. And I was kind of like dreaming through my 7 years of studies, and he started asking me really what I felt were interrogative questions.
Well, what kind of questions?
What's your purpose? Why are you doing this? Why are you studying for 6 years? What do you hope to achieve at the end of the 6 years? Mm-hmm. And I found a lot of people don't think about that question.
Yes.
The long term. So when I came back, I decided that I needed to complete my A-levels to get into university. And just to give you a sense of my lack of knowledge of how education works, I didn't know the type of universities, the different levels, the Russell type of universities, not so Russell type. And when I was applying, I remember going to the careers advisor, and I put down certain universities because they were just the ones I knew. And he looked at me and said, "Someone of your capability, you should be going to these universities." So then I realized that there's a difference in sort of the places that you go to learn. In any case, he and my experience early on in life, and also to escape poverty in some ways, there's an economic element to it. And I think that's rightly justified.
Actually, that reminded me. I forgot to add that you worked in one of the big four companies.
I did work for one of the
qualified as an accountant.
Yeah, I worked for big four.
Yeah, just to add that into the mix.
Yeah. So I did all of that. So that was really. I mean, I'll come to that in a second. But I was really motivated to do something for myself, and the economic argument was compelling at the time. for me. And so I prepared. I went to university. I was quite driven when I was at university. My colleagues will tell you that I was very motivated. I even had questions about this way universities educate people, because I had a madrasa Islamic education. So I was always conflicted between sort of the way they saw the world through finance. I was doing modeling, I was doing financial derivatives, call options, put options, all of these things. And I was always like, this is like really problematic as a Muslim, but I've got to pass the exam at the end of this. So I was studying this stuff at the same time. So that's another question that we can maybe explore later on. But the economic argument was important for me because I really needed to get out of poverty. I'm from a working class family. And my mum particularly was a driving force. She was really supportive. So I did my degree. I worked I did my internships, which is like a summer placement. I was offered a number of positions. The credit crunch came along, so I had to wait for a year, which gave me an opportunity to do some other things. And then I was motivated in finance. And then I kind of realized that this isn't really for me. Moved on, met my wife, and did other things with my life. So I haven't always been, but I think especially later on in life, I found some purpose that drives me in life. And it helps me in any field that I go in. So even when I was doing my PhD, it's in the social sciences, it's theological. So it's very different to mathematics or quants. So I had to retrain almost, or change the way I see the world. But I found that very, very useful. So a lot of the skills that I learned at university are transferable or can be transferable to Islamic studies. I don't see so much a dichotomy as I might have done when I was a young child.
I was going to ask something else, but since you mentioned it, see, one of my things is I've become over time like a little bit skeptical about this notion of what we call quote unquote Islamic studies, because it seems to, on the one hand, what we say is that this as a faith is almost like a theory of everything, right? It's an encompassing way to understand the world. It is which God is at the heart, at the beginning and at the end. And therefore, surely, knowledge or any kind of knowledge could potentially come under that umbrella, as long as it is its intention and its motivation is trying to understand the world through this sort of God-centered lens. Nowadays, when we call it Islamic studies or Islamic sciences, as differentiated from other things out there, like, is that a distinction that you think is that clear to you? Because to me, it's not clear. And if it is clear to you, like, what exactly is the distinction?
Yeah, I think my understanding is different from most people. So if I can just elaborate a little bit. So when we say Islamic studies, in academia, it means one thing. And in a Muslim university, it means another thing. So when we say Islamic studies in the Muslim community, they immediately think about someone who's been to a seminary or studied in Medina or Cairo or somewhere. In the academic world, we're talking about a specific type of Islamic studies. So there is a difference. So maybe you're talking about Islamic studies in the Muslim community, I guess, more than the academic.
Well, I understand the distinction you're making, like how it is in kind of with the Western academy, let's say, and then how we understand it internally. But I think for me, it's also just the notion that, for example, if we say in either of those two cases, if I say the study of biology, right? In neither of those two areas is the study of biology considered to be part and parcel of what we call Islamic studies or Islamic sciences. But to my mind, it's at the heart of it.
Of course.
Okay, so you say of course, yeah. But then in neither of those two realms is that understood?
No.
So then is it the case that actually is the term even helpful then?
No. So this is why you need to, I do this with my students, by the way, when I'm teaching fiqh, for example. And I try to get the students to think about fiqh as not just legal studies. So, which is another conversation. I refuse to translate fiqh at the moment.
Okay.
Because I haven't found a word that actually fits for me.
Okay.
So in my book,
we'll solve it by the end of the conversation.
We'll try and do that, inshallah. But the thing is, sometimes these words can cause more confusion when you try and translate them, or you try and explain them or unpack them, or try and find out what the root meaning is. What fiqh is. As an example, let's move that to one side though. So I think when we say Islamic studies, there is a risk in the mind of most people that you're kind of welcoming backdoor secularism in a way, like you're kind of dividing sciences.
Right.
And it's okay to divide sciences if you understand where they fit in the larger worldview of Islam, if you like. But if they are used to then silo sciences and to say, well, we can't study biology, or we shouldn't study chemistry, or we shouldn't study even philosophy because it can make you a disbeliever, or it can take you down dark paths. My own personal reading of Islamic history, Islamic thought, actually says something quite different, which is that if you pick up books of scholars of the past, if you read their autobiographies, or even if you just read the way they write, you'll get a very strong sense of the idea that the natural world, for example, was very much infused with Islamic concepts, or the idea of science, or whatever else you want to call it, was not as distinguished as we might want to do it. In fact, they threaded it all in. And you see this quite a lot in many, many studies. So there are certain parts which we can say are ta'abbudi. Ta'abbudi means basically they are revelational or strongly revelational. So salah, prayer. There's a strong aspect to it which is to do with God has revealed prayer and this is how you pray. But even within prayer, when you think about it, there's a lot of aspects to prayer which are non-revelational or are revelational but tied to the natural world, natural sciences. So, you know the example of, well, when we work out the times for prayer, that's based on observation. Yeah. It's empirical. You basically decide when to pray or when it...
Well, once upon a time it was, but
yeah.
Now we just look at our phones.
We just look at our phones, but zarf, right? This idea of the container of prayer, which the usulis, the scholars who think about this, talk about this idea of prayer needs to be performed between these times. That's based on natural observation. The Ramadan fasting, though controversial, is still based on natural sciences. And even if we don't do natural science, we still use instruments, right? So whatever debate goes, we're still using science. So I think there's a strong risk, or there is a risk that when we start using Islamic terms or Islamicizing words, or we focus on this too much, there is a risk in the background that we create this artificial binary. And that was at least my reading of both traditional texts when I read them, but also my own reading of Islamic thought and civilization. You find that no, that's an artificial distinction that we sort of bought into in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I still lean to the sort of idea that actually the terminology is it's almost, to my mind, become so unhelpful that it's probably, in an ideal world, just doesn't even need to be used or should be used. Like when we, because if, as I said, just to extend what I was saying before, if we take the realm of, say, biology or politics or other aspects of social sciences, the point isn't the point at the end of the day always that achieving some integration or integrated understanding between, sources, revelation, your context, reason, and then with a view of achieving some sort of directional outcome, meaning in view of some objective, right? Then an opinion is given, a recommendation is given, or things are practiced and done, and are done. Meaning that but that's just a very, it's a very human, right? Natural, normal kind of process. And I just think as soon as we say that something is quote unquote Islamic, right? One of the things that I kind of observe is that actually that as an adjective, if you look at the sources, never existed, right? It's not in the Quran in that way. It's not in prophetic narrations. I understand why it's kind of come in later, but it's almost as if it feels almost like a sectarian type of division, which automatically is going to lend itself to all sorts of problems. Because it's, when you start to extend it all, and this usages of these terms, you have, now you have, Islamic finance, as if to say, well, everything outside of that is necessarily
un-Islamic.
Yeah, exactly, or God doesn't approve of. Whereas if you just put it in its real terms, which is to say, well, what is quote unquote Islamic is simply something that is part and parcel of or aligns with the parameters that are relevant for devotion to God, then all of a sudden the way you start to look at things and describe things and talk to things and the way things can become more relatable to others too, it all changes. So, I mean, I just wonder whether you think that actually terminologically, right, we need to start shifting things or try to maybe avoid these sort of transliterated terms as much as possible in order to make more apparent what exactly it is that we're talking about.
Brilliant. So I think that's one way of approaching it, which is through the language, the prism of language, which I'm a big fan of, by the way. And as Muslims, we need to be more judicious in the way we deploy language. And anyone who studies usul al-fiqh,
which is
the principles of language theory or fiqh,
legal theory, or
legal theory.
Yeah.
But it's more to language theory, because you're trying to understand revelation. What is it that God is saying? What are the implications of this word?
Yeah.
So you have khas, am, which are like, is this word specific? Is this word am? Is it generic? How do we reconcile when we have a statement from the Prophet or the Quran which is specific, and then we have a word which is generic? How do we reconcile that? So that allows you to build a system that allows you to maintain that consistently. It's a reasoning skill, but it's also based on language. So language has always been part of our tradition, and the judicious use of language and culturally relevant use of language has always been there. So for example, if you think about what's called the Persianite languages, so that's usually languages like Urdu, or before that Farsi, Persian, which most people don't study, which I lament, by the way, because that's really an important language for us. So we have words like roza, fasting. We have words like namaz, which we've kind of like indigenized, and they've become part and parcel of our language. And I'm reminded once, in a prayer, in a khutbah, I used the word namaz, and somebody came up to me and said, "Why are you using the word namaz for? Use the word salah." So these things can become contentious, like use the word salah. It's in the Quran. Why do you have to say namaz for? But the audience I was speaking with were people who understood that language. So I use that language because it worked for them. But if it's an English-speaking language, I might use the word prayer because it's more relevant, or dedicated form of prayer, or postural type of prayer, which is because salah is bodily, it's a lived thing. We could talk about that later on, inshallah ta'ala, God willing. So I think another thing that's important is, another way you can look at this is through how we have layered understandings of being. So I was doing some research recently about the idea of wujud, ontology. And there's a really good word in Farsi, Persian, called hasti, like the being. And there are different levels of being, existence in a broad Islamic tradition.
And do you just want to explain then the word ontology for those?
Ontology is a study of being. So like, if you have this glass bottle in front of me, does it exist as a piece of glass, or does it exist in the mind? And why do I call it a glass? What is the relationship between me calling it a glass and does the word glass even exist? Like, it's just a word I've created, right? And human beings are uniquely endowed with this ability, and it's mentioned in the Quran as well. Yes. There's an allusion to it in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah talks about Adam being taught the ability to name things. وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا ثُمَّ عَرَضَهُمْ عَلَى الْمَلَائِكَةِ. So human beings are uniquely endowed with this ability to reason, to acquire knowledge, and to build upon knowledge that they've acquired as well. So it's iterative. عَلَى الْمَلَائِكَةِ فَقَالَ أَنْبِئُونِي بِأَسْمَاءِ هَؤُلَاءِ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. And then angels say, قَالُوا سُبْحَانَكَ لَا عِلْمَ لَنَا إِلَّا مَا عَلَّمْتَنَا. We have no knowledge except what you teach us, referring to God. إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَلِيمُ الْحَكِيمُ. It's very interesting. Allah, the angels describe God as being all knowledgeable and all wise. Very interesting. I mean, there's a lot to be unpacked in that little conversation and that took place in this sort of what you call, primordial existence. So another way of looking at this conversation that we're trying to have here about language is also how we frame things. So if you want to develop 3 layers, broadly speaking, you have what's called aqidah, which is creedal statements. And these are things that are things to do with belief, that a Muslim who enters the faith is expected to believe. They're sort of contracts that you sign. And they're pretty much settled. And they don't require you to do anything. They're not immersive in the sense that you have to physically do something. You just become a Muslim, literally by reciting the Shahada, if you like. And because the barrier to entering Islam is very, very low, a person can just recite the Shahada. There's some debate amongst the ulama, scholars, as in do you have to verbally say it or not. But let's just leave that to one side, or how you have to believe, and does it have to be in the heart and on the tongue. But let's leave that for 1 second. The idea here is that you believe in something. So everybody's a believer just by affirming that there is no God but the one God. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the final messenger. Broadly speaking, if a person believes in that, they pretty much become someone who has submitted to Allah. And then you have, but that's kind of abstract. So then what you have is what's called fiqh. And fiqh is the idea of how do you embody that knowledge today. And so fiqh requires a number of things. One of them is to know the Quran really, really well, not just memorizing it, actually knowing the language of the Quran, the structure of the Quran, what is the Quran saying. And this is foundational. I don't think you can become a scholar if you don't understand how to. I mean, when we were in madrasa, we used to break down sentences. Tarkeeb, we call it, right? We used to do analysis of sentences. That's really important because then you can understand the verse properly. And the same goes for hadith. So once you understand that, it's also about how to apply it in the real world. Now, what happens is fiqh historically developed in a unique sociology, which was the world that it found itself in. So people like to have this Puritan, pristine idea of Islam coming, and there was no world outside of it, and Muslims just practiced. No, they were practicing when they came across the Romans or the Persians. Islam took on a unique, the faith of Islam took a unique flavor based on those civilizational ideas that people were living in. And so the fiqh always adapted and was in response to what people found themselves, the situation that they found themselves in. And that's really, really important to understand. And so part of when you're reading books of the past is to understand, oh, they must have said that because oxes and cows were really common, and everywhere you walked around there was dung everywhere. So that's why the scholars would have this debate around, what if you have this much dung on your clothes, right? It's understood that I've been to parts of India where I see this. It's real. It actually happens. You can't cross a road without getting some dung on your clothes. You have to understand the world that you live in. So fiqh was developed around that idea. But I think what's really important when I read it carefully is that it was a humanistic tradition. So, I was with a mufti just 2 weeks ago, a senior mufti, and we were having a conversation, and he said to me, "Do you not find fiqh boring?" This is what he said to me. I said, "Absolutely not."
It was a trick question. He was testing your commitment. Yeah.
I said, no, it's a living tradition. It's a very humanistic tradition, which are informed by moral and ethical values, which they've taken from the Prophet, peace be upon him, but also this reasoning, this basic reasoning, which is like fitri, which is like natural to human beings. And so fiqh develops alongside sociality, being in the world. And one of the ways you can measure that is, one of the ways you can understand that is, most books always start off with like a principle, like this is the verse in the Quran that talks about this particular thing. And then what they say, well, what if this happens? Okay, from that, what if this happens? What if this happens? And they keep extending it. The idea isn't what ifs per se, it's the abstraction. What is the key, if you want to use mathematical terms, what's the key denominator here? What's the key ma'na here? What's the key principle here that we always have to be aware of? And what they're doing is they're testing it. Because for them, Quran and the Sunnah has to be contextually applicable. It cannot be burdensome. It cannot be overarching on people. So what you'll find is like the early few chapters are on what we would call ritual aspects, if you want to use that word, ta'abbudi. And they are usually embedded within nusus, what we call Quran and Sunnah. So there's a lot of ayat, or there's a lot of discussion around verses of Quran. What does it mean? And of course, a lot of differences come from how you understand verses. Language goes back to language again. And then as you move on, one of the things that you notice is that it's less tied to revelation. This is the point I'm trying to make. It ties less to revelation, more to sociality, more to what is the urf of the people. How do people live this way?
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
What do you mean? The custom of the people?
No, the fact that the linkage, if you like, or the tying that you're talking about, right? You're saying the tying to revelation seems to loosen over time or weaken over time. And then it starts to be linked to this, the social environment or the custom, like the realities. And then over time, like the tradition itself or moments of the traditional development become almost a reference point for the next stage of the development. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's a bad thing if you misunderstand what's the operation here. It's a brilliant thing. It's a brilliant tool if you understand what's actually going on.
What is going on?
What's going on is they are training you in deep thinking. So when they are giving you a principle, they don't give you the answers. You're supposed to think, why did the scholar say this next?
Okay, that's for the process of scholarly training.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And the scholar should do that, right? The teacher he should have learnt enough tools before getting to that stage to understand, oh, this is the next logical question that's going to come about as a result of this particular. It's about thinking things through. So what it does, it immerses you in a form of training, tafaqquh or malaka. We call it malaka. Malaka is like a natural ability to know how to decipher things independent of text. You're not. I mean, I damaged my knee last year, so I was using what are they called? The sticks. What are they called?
Yeah, crutches.
Crutches, right? You're supposed to get rid of the crutches at some point. What most people, they live with the crutches their entire life. When I met the surgeon last year, he said to me, within 6 weeks, those crutches need to be off. You need to be in the gym and you need to be moving and you need to be strengthening those muscles. To use that as a metaphor, what most people do is they still stay with the crutches. So they're always like, they're not able to fully live because they're always relying on what a scholar has said in the past. That's important, but what he said in the past is contextually relevant, but what he's abstracting, the ideas that you can abstract for today is what's missing, is what you need to do. So you can think about many examples in fiqh like this where they are talking about specific scenarios, furu', specific cases, but what you're then able to do is you're able to say, okay, what's actually going on here? What are they training me in? We call it malaka in Arabic. The malaka is like the mufti or the scholar is supposed to have a natural ability.
Like a mastery, no?
Like a mastery, yes. Yeah. You master the craft.
Yeah.
So when somebody asks you a question, your immediate response is not immediate to go to a text and try to find out.
Yeah.
You should by then think, okay, based on what you've said, based on what I've been trained in, these are the particular implications, and this is what the situation might be for you, right? Based on what I know of the text. So it becomes like a natural...
Based on what I know of the text, but also based on this current reality, your situation, etc.
Yeah, like a doctor, if you're a junior doctor or a surgeon, you're a little bit more risk averse, I guess, or you're kind of reading the books a bit more and trying to find out what the guides are saying. But when you become a seasoned surgeon, you can, I guess, by seeing the patient, you pretty much know what needs to be done or what the issue is. And that's what should happen.
Okay.
That development should happen.
Right. But then... but it's not happening, it looks like to me, or not happening enough. That's my assessment. So my assessment is that the those that we call scholars today, the in-depth knowledge and understanding of the revelation, certainly on the surface, often seems to be, I would say, lacking, or it doesn't seem to be an overt reference point. And that might sometimes be because there's an internalization and then they're not necessarily linking back to things, but sometimes it's difficult to see the connection, right, between the way things are said and advised and the thrust of the revelation, let's say. So that's one thing. So another thing is that when we talk about today, when we say the ulama or scholars, in our culture, we have a very clear idea that what we're referring to, and I don't think it's accurate, but it is the case in my understanding, that we are referring to sort of outward law, specialists in outward law, right? Or nowadays, almost specialists in legal history, because they can tell you, like you were indicating, they can tell you, okay, here's what so-and-so said X 100 years ago, but actually, and almost then saying, well, therefore, that's because of that, therefore this is what you're supposed to do now. But almost like an arbitrary kind of reference point, really, just because of the pathway that they happen to go down themselves in their own learning. And where the outward and the inward is often not even integrated. So oftentimes it doesn't seem, and I know that people will say, well, actually, that has its place and this has its place, and there's this study of the outward that is a separate kind of thing to the inward. But actually, the fact that these things are not integrated in the way that education is done, in the way that questions are responded to my mind, is a big reason why you have on the ground a lot of practice of, say, ritual or doing things or following certain rules where most people have no understanding of what exactly they're doing and why they're doing it, right? Just because it becomes very tick box exercise, etc. So by these kind of standards, what is the state of scholarship exactly right now? And is it dynamic? Is it a living tradition? There's a specific example that comes to mind. I know I've said a lot, but just to get an example always does come to mind. Actually, two examples I'll give you on core matters of, say, prayer and salah and zakah, prayer and the giving of alms. Oftentimes, say, in discussions around like travel, right? So when you should, when can you shorten your prayers or not? When you consider to be on travel or not? I can maybe speak for myself, but I would say that based on what I understand of just, where people are at in terms of the kind of advice that they're receiving, it seems as though very little has been done to almost update, the way in which the whole discussion around travel, it takes place, given the almost unrecognizable reality as compared to the past, right? In terms of what travel is and what it looks like. Even just like you almost need a philosophy of travel almost, right? It's a completely different thing nowadays. So but what you hear typically, if you search it online, right, what you will see, this classic 48 miles or 48 kilometers or whatever it is, I can't remember, right? But you've got these various things, which to my mind, I understand that there's this whole process that it went through, but it seems to me that it just hasn't moved on, right? There's no updating in the reference points. So people become confused as to, well, why is this the reference point? Another example might be with zakah. Like one thing, obviously I've spent a lot of my life dealing with this issue. One thing I've never really understood is why I have not observed, and you can correct me again, you can always correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't observed any updated discussion about the nisab, right? Meaning the threshold or the amount of money at the, that it makes you liable to give it, right, and eligible to receive it. Because it effectively is a definition of poverty. That's what it is. But the idea that we are still looking at a certain weighting of silver and gold from back then, and regardless of all of the changes that have taken place in the economy and society, and still multiplying it through, right, by whatever, and now we have this weird situation where you've got one nisab which is like 400 quid and one which is like, I don't know, 5,000 pounds or something, and then some discussion about, is it this or that or whatever. It's like, but neither of these are, to my mind, just on a base. I can understand why it's got there or why it's being looked at in a certain way. But as a definition of poverty, it seems to me completely irrelevant, right? No one on the planet just objectively would say that that's a wise way to look at like what defines poverty today, which is a big question, right? So, and I've said a lot there, but essentially what I'm trying to get to is, where is the scholarship?
So you're interested when you're talking about traveling.
Yeah.
With my Safiya, just to give you an anecdote, we were reading Ibn Battuta one night. And in Ibn Battuta, when you read a story, and the reason I teach or we read these stories, and I think for your viewers it's important to know this, is that one day she will become a scholar, inshallah, God willing. And I want to have her understand Islamic civilization, what we call thaqafat Islamiyya, because she needs to understand how the world was, how the world is, and what the world could be. So when we read these texts, it's a window into the past for her.
Sure.
So she'll ask me, so we're reading about Ibn Battuta, and then he's paying his taxes every time he stops somewhere, because it was a big risk, because he's going for Hajj, yani. But he doesn't end up on a plane from, London Heathrow, safely lands in Jeddah, safely gets to Haram. He's got to travel through all these countries. There's brigands, there's people on the way who are going to steal from him. He ends up going in different directions. So the message I was trying to get to my daughter to understand was, going on a journey was a huge risk. You in many cases you might not come back alive, or even survive. It was a big risk in those days. Sure. Even the Muslim empires tried themselves to protect them. So I was trying to give her the idea that this is the world that existed not so long ago, and now that you can pretty much drop your daughter off at the airport, and you're going through airport security. I mean, what can be more secure than that, Yani? Right? I mean, if that's not secure, I don't know what is secure. And then you board a plane, which is pretty secure, and then you come out the other side and someone collects you. So I was just trying to get her to think about, what was that world like? What is that world like today? We take it all for granted. The second example I gave was achievements we've made in medicine. People live pretty much a long life, usually a healthy life. In fact, most of the problems are induced, like bad eating, bad diet, so forth. And so, I was saying to my daughter that people would get married young in the past, and there's a reason for that. And because we've been reading books, she understood that, right? So that helps her when she reads.
The reason being shorter life expectancies.
Shorter life expectancies, and so it was an economic decision to get married sooner, and also a part of continual lineage. The reason I was telling her all of this, and I get people, this is my point about reading deeper and reading about the past, and not just to make rules, but also to think about the world that they lived in, is that when you're reading these texts and things seem really odd and out of place, you're able to situate it and say, okay,
Right.
yeah, they would say that.
Yeah.
But what is it that they're actually saying?
Yes.
Right, that's what we're saying here. What is it actually saying? So I think that's important. I just want to finish off and just tie my earlier point to your question is that, so we have this idea of theology, which is belief, and fiqh, which is meant to be practice based on the world that you live in. A lot of people miss that. It has to be relevant to the world that you live in. But fiqh is also based on revelation at the same time. So it should be a good, happy marriage between revelation and the world that you live in, right? And then you have what's coming back to what you're asking, which is that another layer you have is what's called ihsan or beauty or tasawwuf, this idea of spirituality. And so a scholar should embody all of those ideas, not just simply be a legalistic person, but also a man of or a person of spiritual depth. So they should be reading ideas where spirituality is important. Why is spirituality important? Well, not just for aesthetic values, but also this idea of beauty in that what you're doing is achieving civilization and humanistic ends. And so it's helping people, it's making things beautiful, because this is part of our tradition as well. And it should not lead to an ugly conclusion. Right? That's not really our faith. Inna Allaha jamilun yuhibbul jamal. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, Allah is beautiful and He loves beauty. So there's in Islam, there's a strong emphasis on jamal, this idea of beauty. Sometimes we go for the jalal, which is this sort of power and or sort of aspect. But actually, I would think in our day and age, jamal needs to be more preponderant. This idea of beauty in what we do. And so what scholars need to do is they need to, including myself as a student of knowledge, is that once you've had a decent madrasa education, you should never stop. The biggest error that you can make, and any person can make, is to stop learning. And there's this false idea that once I've studied for X amount of years, I'm the mufti now, and I'm the sheikh now, and everybody, it's like Wizard of Oz, the road's paved with gold. I should walk down that path, and everybody should just bow before me. No, you have to then prove yourself. And one of my teachers, when I was with him in America, pointed this out to me that, that's when it really begins. And it comes through scholarship, and it comes through helping people, and you have to be relevant to them. One of the things that's really missing today, in my view, is that we don't write anymore. We're not people of letters. So a lot of this is debating over WhatsApp. If you have a certain position, write it down, put it down on paper, write it, articulate it, let other people read it. Why is that important? Well, when you're writing it, you're thinking carefully about the implications of what you're saying, and you know that it will be scrutinized. And so that's what we do in PhDs and masters, right? You put it out there and you publish it, and then people can then, based on what you've written, say, well, this is what you've said, and these are arguments, and this is what you cited, and which is the conclusion that you've come to, and they can see your working. That's not happening as much. We do have, alhamdulillah, we do have some people who are doing that, but I think more writing needs to happen. Now, it's easy for me to say that as someone who has done some studies and continues to study. And I also think this ties to a bigger problem, which is a structural issue, that in most cases, most people who go into studies are from working class backgrounds. So naturally, their primary concern is that once they finish their studies, they want to get a job, they want to earn some money, which is a natural concern. I've met some of these students, and I've had the honor of teaching them, who are very bright or have the potential to achieve so much for the Muslim community and for British society widely even. I would go further. But what happens is, they become an Amazon Prime driver because they have to make ends meet. So some of us in the Muslim community, especially those who have a bit more wealth and are more connected, we need to find structures or ways, but we don't take every graduate, because I don't think that's necessary. It's not a farz ayn. It's not a responsibility for everybody, but we should create maybe a guild of scholars, or create avenues where we take some of our best students, maybe send them to Cambridge as well on top, or Oxford, so they get a really good education there, and then they come back into the Muslim community, and we recognize them as the ulama, and that requires some serious investment. It's not just about throwing money, but it's also about having people who understand the needs and can find and nurture these young men and women. Because at the moment, what's happening, in my experience, is that we have a lot of young, talented madrasa graduates. I'm on the phone to them regularly, and they have a huge amount of potential, but their primary concern is that they need to earn money to get married. They need stability. They need to do X, Y, and Z. And if you're working 9 to 5, you have very little time to write, a 14-volume book on fiqh or on aqidah, because your time is spent entirely trying to make ends meet. And the ones that do it are doing it because they have a passion for that subject. And so what I try and tell students is that you have to find a passion in it, but if you can, try and find yourself in a financial stable situation. So I think maybe thinking about awqaf situations or endowments where we can take some of our students on and say to them, we'll fund your PhD, we'll fund your studies in a specific field. I'm also going to be very honest. Not everyone needs to become a doctor or an engineer. We need thinkers. We need people who can do thinking for us, and social science is one of them. I know there's a bias because I've done some training in there, but I think if you have people who are trained in social sciences, it helps you because you're marrying what you've learned with the world as it exists today, and then you're able to think deeply and give solutions, written solutions, presenting those solutions to the Muslim community. Say, well, this is what we've been doing, this is what we've understood, but actually, when we read it very, very carefully, and this is what we should be doing, actually.
I understand what you're saying, and I agree broadly in, say, some of the solution kind of that you're putting forward in terms of we need investment, right? And we need to give people the space and the time to develop, right, in terms of their learning, their knowledge, and so that they can start to offer solutions. I haven't understood yet from you, though, what your assessment of the current situation actually is. I mean, because I painted what I think is quite a bleak scenario in terms of how it is. And I'm an optimist in terms of that it can get better if we get our act together. But is my assessment fair? Or am I being harsh?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe London's like this. For me, it's a mixed picture. I have to be honest. In some places, in some situations, I despair. And at my age, Iqbal, you know when to cut your losses. So you don't hang on to things that you know are clearly not working.
But you're in your 40s, right?
I'm in my 40s.
Yeah. So you're still pretty young.
Alhamdulillah. So I try. So in some places, it's very bleak. I mean, I've sat with people, and so if someone presents themselves as a scholar or a student of knowledge, and they want to have a discussion about knowledge-based stuff, then I'll start asking them questions, not to interrogate them, just to see the depth of the understanding. And usually the way they ask questions or the way they frame a subject will tell you a lot about how much they understand the subject. And in some situation, it's very bleak. Yeah. I'll give you an example, just to give an example. You have people who go to study for like 10 years, 7 years, who you would have developed a deep understanding of the implications of revelation. And they can reason with it. And so, sometimes they'll have something, and what they'll do is they'll throw a hadith at you. Right? They'll say, in this hadith, in Abu Dawood, it says this. And why are you doing this? And I'm like, hang on, let's take a step back. So we call it epistemology. What is your method of truth? How do you get to truth? Is it basically going straight to revelation and then pulling out something that suits or you think made sense to you? Or is it actually a lens through which you understand revelation, a method, right? Because through that, I can't see your method. You're basically just taking a hadith that you've probably got on sunnah.com and it suits you and you're just throwing it at me. I can't see your method in there. So I can't say, well, I can't help you because I don't know if that's your method.
Yeah, and I would just want to add to that. One of my frustrations is that in response, like I think the general public then is kind of not treated with respect or taken seriously, such that the method that is important to understand is at least sufficiently included within a response, even to a simple or basic question, or the underlying principle, just even at an essential level, so that people can make the connection between the thing that you're telling me to do and how it just makes sense, basically.
Yeah. I think part of that is, I agree with you, and part of that is also to do with the audience. So if you're dealing with someone who just needs an answer, you give them the answer. But if you know that person is thinking, he might even have doubts about Islam, then you should make a bit of an effort to try and say, well, we do this. Yeah.
But I think even a simple person needs it helps, because at the moment, just because we've got this very robotic kind of sometimes a bit of a mindless culture about, and ritualized kind of culture in terms of a lot of these things, I feel it's kind of scholarly then responsibility to, even for the so-called simple person who just needs a response, for them to also understand as well, right? But anyway, you were saying, so fine, in some places it's bleak and you have this conversation, not clear what the method is, but then who or where does a and someone who is just educated in a normal way, conscientious, is trying to make sense of their faith in this modern context, for legal questions and responses in such a way that they feel, it settles within them as reasonable, and relatable and explainable. Who or where are they going?
Yeah.
Where do we go for responses today?
I don't know where people go to.
No, where should they go?
They should come to me.
I love it.
They should come to my website, Hujjah Academy, which we launched.
What academy?
Hujjah Academy.
Okay.
We're going to rebrand it.
But you've got to anglicize that one.
Yeah, we need to find a time. I just use Hujjah Academy because it's based on a very intellectual, important scholar of the past that I think helps answer some of the questions. He's not the only one, but his name is Shah Waliullah Dehlawi. It's not a secret. If you go on my YouTube channel, I almost talk about him a lot. But he just to quickly mention, the Hujjah Academy is based on the ideas and the thoughts of Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, because he did something that we're talking about, which I think is worth mentioning, which is that he wasn't slavishly following tradition, what came before him. He was taking all the aspects of tradition, and what worked, he worked with it. Whatever didn't work, he left it one side. And he was a bit like a honeybee. So in the Quran, the bee is a very interesting creature, because I don't know if you have them in London as much. I saw them in some of the parks, but where we live, we have bees, alhamdulillah. And the bee is a fantastic creature, because the analogy of the bee is very interesting. It's not mentioned explicitly in the Quran, but Allah uses the bee as a way of thinking about how we should be in the world. And I think Shah Waliullah, among others, represented that. What does a bee do? Well, a bee flies around. It's busy, and it's non-discriminatory. We talk about this idea of knowledge systems. Wherever there's benefit, it will take from different flowers. And you see them sometimes, they're working really, really hard. And then what does it do? It goes back and it makes honey. Manfa'a linnas, something that's beneficial for people. But when you have that honey, you don't know which flower it's from. But what it's done, it's basically taken the best of everything, combined it, and created something new. If you're really smart, you'll know where it's coming from. So when you're reading, if you read carefully, you'll know, when this scholar has this view, he's taken it from this strand. But then he doesn't take the entire strand. Then from another aspect, he'll take from another strand, because for him that makes sense. So that's part of like the way we should be. We should be like taking the French word is bricolier, this idea of bricolage, which is the bee, I guess the best way to describe it, which is this idea of like you take what's around from everywhere, judiciously, carefully, and then you create something new that's beneficial for many people. So it has nutritional value, if you like.
Yeah, sure.
It benefits humanity. It fills that void in them.
No, I like that. And it kind of like, to give a more contemporary example, it's like, tech startups or tech solutions, right? Where consumers enjoy a simple, useful, relevant solution to solve a particular problem. And then there'll be varying degrees to which they appreciate what's gone on behind the scenes, right? Depending on their own level of knowledge or understanding, they'll appreciate like the different processes and things. Because oftentimes we hugely underestimate what has gone on behind the scenes to bring something that is beautiful, effective, relevant, easy to use, etc. So it's kind of similar type of idea, right? In terms of the processes that are needed. But I'm finding it interesting and funny that you kind of have, because it's an unusual thing for people to do, and then for you to, for you particularly to do, knowing you as the humble man that you are, to say that in my response to my question about where people should go to get the responses that they need, that you've put yourself out there. So I'm going to be pushing you.
I
now.
guess I'm following Prophet Yusuf alayhi salatu salam. When a need came. Because you can be, it doesn't mean, it's not arrogance, right?
No, sure.
It's not arrogance to put yourself forward if you think that there's a need to be filled. Yeah. And, it's not like when I talk to people, I hope I don't come across as like, I know everything. Yeah. I'm always inquisitive.
Yeah.
When I sit with students of knowledge, when they say things, I do interrogate it a little bit. I do push it. I just say, does that make sense? Because intuitively it has to make sense. So when someone throws something out in a sermon or in a public speech, I might go to the scholar afterwards or might privately message them and say, you said this, but do you know that the position is actually X, Y, and Z on this? But going back to my point, I think sometimes what happens is a clash of epistemology. So in my book, I talk about this a little bit. Inshallah, it'll come out soon. I talk about this idea of what seems to have happened is we kind of like, we bypass sometimes the thinking tradition, the lived tradition, because it's okay to go to Bukhari, for example, right? Imam Bukhari. And it's okay to pick a hadith, but it's not okay to just take a hadith as it is there, because you're going to find there are contradictions. And a lot of young people have problems with that. A lot of young people come to me and say, Sheikh, this hadith says this, or this hadith goes against scientific consensus. It's because we've framed it in such a way that it has to be in such a way. Whereas if you think it through, the hadith could be understood, it has different layers of how hadith could be understood, and it can be synthesized in a way that it's not contradictory, it's actually complementary. What happens is sometimes even people do unthinkingly, they quote a hadith that they sometimes say, oh, this proves our school of law. But the fuqaha, the jurists, haven't used that hadith. They've taken the whole gamut of the entire tradition and said, oh, we take this principle based on the entire hadith, study of the hadith. I'll give a simple example. So I was teaching my students fiqh. And when I teach them fiqh, I do it from an usuli tradition. So I say, well, this makes sense because we follow this particular way. But Imam Shafi is bound to say this because he follows this particular methodology, which is fine. But what I say to them is, you don't always have to have a hadith for something. Why do you have to restrict yourself so much? What happens is you take the hadith, all of them, the entirety. They're like data points. The way I give the example is they're like data or images. And you would be a fool to make a conclusion based on one piece of data, like one image. What you would do is take the entire, all the images, even the ones that you suspect might not even be relevant. You take them and you say, okay, what are the ideas that are being abstracted from these images? This idea, for example, in fiqh that we don't want people fighting, mufti ila al-munaza'a, and if contracts that lead to disputes, or this idea one should not harm, one party should not be harmed. These are all taken from like an abstraction or deeper thinking about what the hadith is about. And so they become like usul almost. They almost become like principles that you can think with. They are strong as mutawatir. Why? Mutawatir means mass transmitted hadith. They're almost like mass transmitted hadith. Somebody will say to me, oh, the Prophet never said that. He did say it, you just haven't read it properly.
Right.
You just haven't read it properly.
I mean, between the lines.
You haven't read between the lines. He said it so many times that it doesn't need to be said. Sometimes it's what's not said that's important, right? That's what's not said that's important. And so what happens is, that this is, we have this idea called illati ma'thura, this idea like a cause which is so well transmitted, is so embodied in the Quran and Sunnah, for example, that it's just like it's almost like the Prophet said it.
So this is like a legal cause, meaning that the reason why. The reason behind a particular ruling, for example.
Yeah, when that legal cause comes, the ruling comes.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not mentioned in Quran and Sunnah, but it's mentioned so often, so often. It's almost like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Any examples you can give?
So, for example, in Hanafi madhab, we have one example. So, this idea of wilaya, sovereignty of the self. I call it sovereignty. Wilaya basically means that you are, once you're mature, once you're a free person, you're able to make your own decisions. And nobody can make decisions for you if you're sane of mind. That is so well known in Hanafi madhab because you find it in nearly every chapter.
But you might not find it explicitly stated, mentioned, but so implicitly.
For example, how does this really work in practice? Well, for example, a woman who's now become baligha in Hanafi madhab, she can get herself married off. Right?
Meaning she is of the age of maturity.
She's the age of maturity. She has wilaya. Yes, the fuqaha, the jurists will say, it's best for her father to be involved. But there's this idea that she has sovereignty of herself. She can do financial transactions for herself. This isn't mentioned explicitly in the hadith, but you'll find it so often mentioned.
Implied, yeah.
So what I'm saying is that if you don't have this training, you'll make silly judgments. You'll make silly conclusions. So what I was trying to tell the students is that don't become like almost like we have to have a hadith for this. Right? Because what you're actually doing, you're narrowing the tradition. You're narrowing the richness of how we do things. And they have to be consistent. And these are tried and tested positions. And what they also do, Iqbal, is that they give you flexibility. They allow you to then, when you have new scenarios, you're like, okay, we know what are, when it comes to marriage, we know what are the key principles in marriage that we can't violate, right? And then you just work around it. That's what I'm trying to say. So it allows you to bring out what was said in the Quran and Sunnah, what the fuqaha have said, and then it allows you to then implant it, if you like, in scenarios where it might have not been said explicitly, but you know that your ballpark figure, you're kind of really within that area. So that training needs to happen a lot more. And you asked me the question, is it happening? I don't think it's happening as much. And sometimes I do despair when I meet people, because the example I gave is someone threw a hadith at me once. He asked me something about something that I said, and I said, because I like to play devil's advocate, because you're the one that's challenging me now, so you have to provide the evidence. Yes. Right? I don't need to provide evidence first. You have to provide the evidence. You have to do the tabyin, bring the evidence to me. And so I said, where's the evidence? And he went on sunnah.com and he threw a hadith at me, which is fine. But he'd been training for 7 years in a madrasa, for 10 years. So why are you throwing a hadith at me for? Then I said, okay, well, this Judas has said this. And you can see even the one who's mentioning that hadith, in fact, the particular debate we're having, even the hadith that he was citing, believe it or not, the one who was narrating it was known to have done contradictory to what he said.
Right.
So I was like, what does that tell you in our usul? Right? And he couldn't answer it. I'm like, well, with all due respect, you've studied for 7 years, 10 years, and you're missing like these obvious red lines.
So that would suggest that potentially the institutions where these studies are taking place, like those systems are, well, underperforming.
Yeah, or it's not being, the lived tradition is not being passed on. It's just like you just copy and paste.
So is that changing? I mean, obviously a lot of your work has been, you've gone through the Darul Ulum seminary system. You've studied it. That's the focus of your PhD as well. You're regularly interacting with students who are in this system or emerging from this system. How much if somebody who's going into or is going through a Darul Ulum today, let's say in Bury or Blackburn or any of these kind of places, many of whom then end up being imams or part-time imams in mosques around the country, how different is their experience today versus how it would have been 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, good question. I approach it differently. I approach it from the perspective of the individual.
No, sure, but is their experience, meaning the answer, if you don't mind, just answer this one
I
first.
think I would.
Has it changed much or not?
It has changed.
And if it has
changed at least in the environments that I'm in.
Okay.
So I don't know about
in what way?
So there's more of an encouragement to think through things. There's more of an openness to other ideas, other traditions, if you like.
Other traditions, meaning legal traditions?
Other legal traditions.
Okay.
So people who might have studied in different environments with different teachers. There are, as always, there's always more emphasis in one field than another over time. So, like it's nice to see that in some places, tajweed has taken a bit of a prominence, right? For some people. In my time, it wasn't the case.
Okay.
And it comes down to people's, it comes down to teachers as well. Sometimes the influence of a certain teacher who's very passionate about certain
But that
subject.
seems a very sort of basic development, right? Now we're
looking back.
But now we're going to focus on how to articulate letters in a proper way versus.
I mean, I know it's very popular because a lot of people focus on it. Yeah, but I think.
What about the context side? What about actually doing law in the now, like, and an understanding of the broader situation? Because I know Cambridge Muslim College, where you're a trustee, and I want to kind of come onto that just so we understand what's going on there. But like the one of the objectives of Cambridge Muslim College being founded was, initially to act as a bit of a conversion course, right, for the people who've gone through this traditional seminary study. But in an ideal world, you shouldn't need the conversion course. So, are things moving, or have things moved in the last kind of few decades, where the contextual components are being integrated into this quote unquote traditional kind of studies?
At least spaces that I'm involved with, the conversation is happening, and there have been moves to try and do that.
Such as, like, what might students be experiencing now?
Students might be, for example, things to do with, they might be taken out of the seminary, which never used to happen, to go to schools or to different environments, non-Muslim environments, just to see how
just
exposure to those worlds.
Yeah.
So a bit like what schools try and do now.
What about the study of modernity, or, for example, when you're looking at fiqh, some aspect of the law, or some legal ruling, that it's not just being done with reference to medieval texts, but it's also being done, like, say, for example, this example I gave about travel, and you commented on, that it's actually considering, the nature of transport today as part and parcel, and find the tradition and original sources, whatever, to then give a holistic picture. Is that kind of process happening?
No, not in a seminary space itself. Yeah. It should happen. The challenge we have in the seminaries don't have the resources for it as well. Part of the problem challenges, or sometimes they're just not interested. Some people don't see the need for it. like if you say to them, what's modernity? Why do we need to teach modernity?
Sure.
This is all sacred.
Yeah.
This is the Quran and Sunnah.
Yeah.
Like why do we need to
They want to move on. Yeah.
why don't we need to do it? Why? I think that's I agree with you. That's part of the challenge. But I will come back to something that I wrote about in my book, which is that I'm increasingly moving, and life's a journey. So I'm increasingly moving to a view that what might be useful is that whether it can happen or is I don't know, but we create what's called religious functionaries.
Okay, what's that?
So a religious functionary is someone who just is the imam. He's just the imam. He leads a prayer, beautiful job, important duty, but he's not a scholar, right? He can tell you the basics of prayer or fasting, and he can help you with maybe the pastoral elements.
Yeah, that was the word that was coming to mind. Yeah, it's more of a pastoral role.
Yeah, so maybe like 4 or 5 years they do that for. They don't need to spend 6 years to do that. 3 years, 4 years. And then they can top up if they want to become a scholar. And then what happens then is that's more rigorous. So you learn basic Arabic, maybe the basics of your faith, to be able to speak to the public. Because I think there's different spaces. The imam is more working in the public space. So he needs to be more attuned to the public space. But there's a scholarly space. I'm going to Vienna in a few weeks to talk about this idea of different spaces that Muslim scholars should be working in. Yeah. And one of them is a scholarly space, which isn't the public space, a different space, which is this idea of scholarship, looking at some of the questions that you've asked, we have, where they can dedicate themselves to get the training, the deeper training, where they can expose themselves to do a PhD, for example. Because, if they do something in the social sciences or philosophical sciences or something, it will expose them. But they should be people who have the intellectual curiosity. I think that's an important skill to have. Openness of mind. They should be well rooted, so they should know their stuff at a certain level. That's where the teachers come in, or people who can help them come in. And they shouldn't be everybody. They should be like a group of people. We don't need mass. Ulama production. What we need is ulama production that is well respected, that are able to think deeply for us, and do the thinking for us, engage with wider society, and really focus on producing research papers, scholarly papers, which they can present. And we also need to create a culture, I think, where people are able to present their ideas and not get shot down. I think a lot of times people are scared. I speak to a lot of young students of knowledge who've done a lot of research, and they're absolutely frightened to talk about things because.
I mean, you must have faced that yourself. You must have felt that before.
Yeah. I've been bullied.
Fear of
I've been bullied.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm old enough to now just punch back.
Yeah.
I just punch back, but I have been bullied. I've had threats to my life. I mean, that's how bad it is.
In the context of doing what?
I might have had a certain view, which is a very well-known view in a certain school, which maybe I didn't articulate it well enough or whatever, and somebody's heard it without knowing that actually it's a valid view, which actually shows their superficial understanding, and they've gone out and then said something in a public audience about it, which has led to me being personally. I've received threats, and I'm like, this is not scholarship.
It's more like gangster culture.
Gangster culture, right? And I've been. I mean, there is a duty of care by scholars not to put out controversial things that might destabilize people's worldview, right? It has to be done judiciously. I get that. I'm completely with it. I have a lot of views that I don't talk about publicly. But if you come to my house for a cup of coffee, I'll completely break it down and I'll tell you, right, this is how it is, and this is how I think we should do things. But I won't talk about it publicly because I know people just aren't ready for it. And so that's where fiqh and iftar comes together. Like this idea of you've got to work with the people. You've got to work at the pace of the people. And a lot of times, a lot of people, because they don't have depth in reading, they don't have a humanistic tradition. The Darul in Islam is a humanistic tradition. It's about how to help people. It's a living tradition. It should be a living tradition. And so when you read these books carefully and you think about things for yourself carefully, you come to realize that a lot of this is actually just about helping people. The scholars were adamant that that's what they were doing. It wasn't just about, this is haram. Like we have this culture now, like everything's just haram. Like, you talked about Islamicizing everything. We have another side, which is like everything's just about making everything haram. This is haram, this is haram, this is haram. I'm like, why is it haram?
Meaning forbidden,
yeah. Yeah, forbidden. What's the principles on on what basis?
Yes, as if that's the default, and then you have to justify something permissibility.
Whereas like in buyu, in financial transactions, the default is everything's permissible. Riba, The prohibition of riba is an exception.
Exception to the rule.
It's an exception to the rule. Because Allah says in the Quran, read the Quran, my friends. Like Allah says in the Quran that He has made buyu, financial buying, the buying and selling, permissible for you. The default, what we call ibaratun nas, like the explicit meaning there is Allah has made you can buy and sell. And not only in that verse, in other verses, Allah actually says go out and do business, or like He even contrasts it with prayer.
But that's also like an implicit. It's like it's also implicit too, as well as explicit. I mean, people are doing that anyway. They're going to do that regardless. That's just human.
Yeah, and Allah in the Quran, as you know, the Quran uses financial language even in times of like, even when it's trying to encourage people to be good people.
Or by way of analogy.
By way of analogy. So you find that, but if a lot of people would find, a lot of people, if they didn't know that was in the Quran, they'd find that problematic. Oh, you're mixing religion with business. Right? But God's doing it. God's like not mixing it, but he's using that language because He knows like you want to make business. He knows that you want to be successful. What's wrong with being successful? And there's no like conditions that you have to be successful in a certain way. Riba is a specific, it's what we call istihsan. In principle, is this idea of an exception to the rule. And exceptions at least in Hanafi madhab that I'm trained in, Hanafi school, an exception is an exception to that extent. Yeah. Because it's disrespectful to the Prophet and God to extend it beyond what the revelation talks about. It's like a respect for tradition, or respect for revelation, which God has prohibited. That's it. We don't need to like then sort like, kind of like outsizing it to like bigger issues. Allah has made buying and selling permitted. We have chapters and chapters and chapters about how to do business, right? And there's this idea, well, certain things are problematic. We know what the causes are. So we know what the causes of interest are, or not interest. I wouldn't use it. Let's use the word riba. Again, maybe we can have a conversation about how should we translate riba into English.
That's another discussion. Yeah.
Because there are two causes for riba. Makili, mawzu, like things that are weighed.
Don't even get into it now because we don't have the time.
We don't have the time. But what I'm saying is that these things are known. Like these things are known. So we know what they are. That's it. We don't need to like worry about it.
Sure.
So we need to train people to really, you talked about imams and I talked about religious functionaries. I think what we need is religious functionaries, people who can just do the day-to-day.
Yeah, and then you need like proper actual high-level scholarship.
We need to think about how we can train them and take like some of our most talented people. And a lot of them come from working class backgrounds. I mean, I can name off the record at least 15, 20 students that I know who have huge potential. Like I could see them in 10 years becoming like some of our go-to scholars because they're interested. They all have the singular purpose of like deepening their learning. They're constantly reading, they're constantly thinking, they're challenging things, and but they won't be able to express themselves because of certain restrictions, financial restrictions, or even broader culture doesn't allow it. It is happening in some places, but I will say this, a lot of it's happening outside institutional structures.
Right, exactly.
It's not happening in the institutions because institution structures, I mean, it's not just Darul Ulums or madrasas, it's in universities. They kind of like, they take the oxygen out.
Yeah. I mean, one thing, that's it. I was going to ask you this. For somebody who's interested in pursuing a path of study and learning, would you advise going through, spending 6-7 years going through one of these so-called traditional institutions? Sometimes I thank God that I never went. I was quite close myself to going into the Darul Ulum, actually, once upon a time. But now I thank God that didn't happen, And like, and sure, there's maybe certain types of things I missed out on or haven't spent as much time looking at. But I'm a lot more comfortable with the way I've ended up framing things overall. Like without having, like you said, like I felt like I've had the room and the space, and I don't have these affiliations, which then I'm having to figure out how to, detach myself from, or have to spend years of my life now unlearning things which I learned as, which I would have learned as kind of, absolutely central. And it seems especially for young people going into these things, it's like there hasn't almost been the time, or there often isn't the mentorship to help them navigate those things, even if they did go through them, so that they have they're able to do so in a kind of a balanced way. Just as I would suggest somebody who's going through conventional education, conventional university for, whatever degree, that they almost, at the time you see it as like your whole world, right, of learning and everything else, rather than seeing it as just part and parcel of a whole set of potential inputs and information. So you're saying it's already happening outside of institutional structures. Is that the way? Because once upon a time, I mean, there's a mix, right, in history, in terms of those who traveled around and met this teacher and met that teacher, and there was this organic amassing of knowledge. And then there was also kind of this whole institutional thing. What's the nowadays, given the state of institutions, should we go there?
I sometimes, just to go back a second, I sometimes feel there's a fetishization of learning as well. Like people like
it becomes an objective in its own right, as opposed to
like people
for some
think
purpose.
People don't realize that it's burning a lot of midnight oil.
Oh, I see. I see. You mean it's kind of glorified as some sort of enjoyable process, but actually there's a lot of hard work.
Like people don't realize that there actually is some real brain juice, as I call it, that needs to be utilized. Like, you have to think really deeply about these things. Yeah. And it comes with emotional and social risks as well. Yeah. It can be very overwhelming. It can be very overwhelming. You have your own challenges. You get harassed. You get bullied. But you also meet some brilliant people along the journey. Alhamdulillah. And I have some teachers who I've studied with in the Darul Ulum who are brilliant. They've nurtured me. I have two particular teachers in particular. I won't mention their names, but who've allowed me to become who I am. And they've got phone calls about me. They've received phone calls about, oh, Haroon, he's like this, he's like that. But because they know me at a personal level, and they know my challenges and what I've been through, they're like, yeah, we know what you're doing, and they'll just give me some cautious words. But they won't cut my legs off and say you can't do this.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's the sign of a good teacher, by the way. Yeah, a good teacher always wants his students to excel. I tell my students this; they'll be watching this afterwards, and I tell them in every class, literally, I want you to become better than me. Nothing would make me happier than to see all of you excel. So going back to your question about what was the idea?
No, so like an A-level student or a university age student now, who's now thinking, I want to be, I want to be a scholar, right? Okay. Or, the word I like to use more is like public intellectual. Okay. First of all, because it's contemporarily used, and also it implies a bridging between the ivory tower scholarship and actually relevant communication out there, right? Good. Meaning that it is an academic, it is someone who with depth of learning, but they've taken it upon themselves to get out there and communicate in the public
and that's
setting.
Very prophetic, by the way, because...
Yeah, exactly, it's not like ivory tower theory.
I mean, the Prophet, peace be upon him, we know, spoke in very jami, comprehensive terms. Accessible terms, but when you think about it, he has some deep truths.
Oh, of course.
Right? But he was able to speak in a way that made sense to people.
Exactly.
That's what scholars need to do, by the way.
Okay, so somebody who's now at university or A-level stage, and they want to go down this path, they're thinking, okay, I can either enroll in some local, seminary here. I can do undergraduate or postgraduate Islamic studies, quote unquote, in a Western, quote unquote, university. I don't like any of these terms personally, but that's why I quote unquote them. Or I can go abroad. I can go to, I can go to Saudi Arabia. I can go to, Egypt. Maybe, I don't know what the other options are nowadays, right? Jordan, maybe. Faced with all of these options, or a more organic kind of process. I mean, what is I know there's not one right answer.
There's no one right answer.
I know there's not one right answer, but like, how would you? What advice would you give so that somebody has a way in which they can actually make an informed decision?
Yeah, let me give you some considerations instead. That might be a better way of thinking about this. One thing you need to ask yourself is, what is your purpose of doing this? If you're doing this to serve your community, there are different ways you can do it. So you have to ask yourself the question: what is the maqsad? What is the purpose of you pursuing this path? And you need to have it in a sentence. I need to come to you and ask you, if I ask you a question, what is the purpose of this? I don't want to hear like, oh, I want to help people. What is the actual purpose? What is your guiding principle in all of this? Number two is you have to be aware of the community that you might be coming back to. So in some communities, you might have done 20 years in Syria or Jordan or Egypt. You're not going to be recognized by the brutal fact that you haven't studied in Darul Ulum. So you have to balance that. In some communities, I don't know about London, but in some communities, it does matter. Whether we like it or not, it's a different matter, but that is the truth. The third thing is you need to find and marry that with the third thing, which is that whatever you're planning or going to learn, do your homework, and does that institution or does that space allow you to do scholarship? Or is it just a place where you're just going to get titles and you're just going to go through a syllabus, pass some exams, and you're going to have a big ceremony at the end and everybody's going to call you Fulan Sheikh? Or are you really wanting to go to learn, to deepen your learning, ask those questions? And you might not get that in the seminary. It might mean that you just have to do it, and sadly, because it's the cultural need. But one thing that I will tell every serious student of knowledge is that you should never stop learning. You should continuously push the boundaries of every topic, every subject, and deepen your understanding until you get to a stage where you're comfortable talking about a topic off the cuff. Like somebody says to you, if Iqbal got you on his podcast and said, talk to you about me marriage, the philosophy of marriage. You should be able to talk about it without going to a book and kind of like the scholars. Because what we do is we sometimes like to lean on scholars a lot. We do it all the time. We're like, Ibn Taymiyyah said this, or Shah Waliullah said this, or Ghazali said this.
Yeah,
And we're
like, that's great, but what do you say?
what do you say? What is your view on this?
Yeah.
And he was talking to the people of his time, and they all had confidence to say it. They were bold enough to put it down on paper and stand by it. Yes, it's created a history of debates.
And also to change their mind as well.
Yeah, change their minds. And they have left, like if you look at Abu Hanifa, there was a time in history where he was seen out of orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Many people don't know this. There were many scholars
Of
who wrote against him.
Yeah, they were kind of a lot. Yeah, and a lot of others were also like, let's say, at the fringes of their reality.
Yes, I mean, Imam Ghazali's books were burnt at a certain point.
Yeah.
Ibn Taymiyyah was excruciated, like he was almost like excommunicated with some of his views. But everybody reads them now. Ibn Arabi still is controversial, but if you read him really carefully, he's phenomenal. If you read him really carefully, as some scholars have written, he's actually got more in common with Ibn Taymiyyah than you actually think. Right? I mean, we don't want to get into this conversation. These are some other points. What I'm saying is that the point I'm trying to make is that to be a scholar is like being a warrior. Like you have to be ready to people to throw assaults at you and accusations against you. One of my teachers, when he was teaching me Imam Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, that's his famous work, and we were reading through the passages. He said two things to me. He said, learn from Imam Ghazali's life that you have to be brave. You have to do things that will change the world. You might not see it in your life, but you have that long-term vision that people will read your works and say, you know what, this person had something going for him. The second thing he told me was, when people read Imam Ghazali or his book Ihya Ulumuddin, they always misquote it as a Sufi text. If you read it really carefully, it's a text. We talked about this before, this idea of scholars being polymaths.
Yeah, and it integrates a lot of things.
And he integrates psychology, philosophy, logic. He integrates everything into a text. It's a masterpiece for his time. It's a masterpiece. Now, there's some things in there which won't work today. Like having these diets of, like, he mentions a scholar called Sahal Dastari, where he would just eat wheat, raw wheat. I mean, London, I tried again in London.
It's funny, nowadays the diets for people just eating meat, right?
Right, just eating meat, right? Yeah. Just to say, but they had it for more spiritual reasons, right? Not just to lose weight or whatever. But the point I'm making is that those things clearly don't work today. So I think what scholars need to do today is that they have to get to a level of confidence where they lose their crutches and become their own person. That's not going to happen in institutional settings, even university settings. Like
you've got to, regardless of what path you've got to go your own path.
You've got to set your own path, and you've got to be brave enough. And that means you need to have rusukh fil ilm, depth in knowledge. And Allah says this in the Quran. وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ يَقُولُونَ آمَنَّا بِهِ. It's interesting that depth in knowledge correlates with faith. Right?
Of course.
وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ يَقُولُونَ آمَنَّا بِهِ كُلٌّ مِّنْ عِنْدِ رَبِّنَا. So in other words, you know how sometimes people say, I sometimes hear it's very sad. I hear denigrating remarks about people being too scholarly. I even hear the opposite side. Oh, you're really into scholarship and you're really reading so much. I'm like, you don't understand. When you know why God tells you to do something, when it makes sense to you, when you can philosophize prayer.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. If you stood up in a mosque or you went to a masjid or a community and said, you've been praying 5 times a day, your entire life, explain to me why you do what you do. What does the posture symbolize? Why is it postures? Why can't you just sit there and just like be a good person?
Yeah, and meditate. Yeah.
Or why do you go for Hajj? People are spending like 15,000-20,000 pounds going for Hajj, right? Oh, we're going for Hajj. Get a WhatsApp message. I'm going for Hajj. Okay, why are you actually going for Hajj? And they're so obsessed with like, have I done this? Yes, there are things that you have to do. I mean, I get that. But why go around the Kaaba? Why go to Arafah? Why go to Muzdalifah? What is the symbolism in that? And that's already been articulated. It's already been articulated by
it's just not being sufficiently conveyed now.
But most people don't know it.
Yeah.
If you speak to people, they can tell you what breaks a fast and But what's fast meant to do? What is it actually doing to your spiritual state, your moral state of being? And because we're not having those conversations, and because we're not able to articulate it for whatever reason, what happens is just someone stands up and he just gives you a bunch of do's and don'ts, and everybody's like, yeah, Islam is just like, it's this straight jacket you wear. I should have worn a straight jacket. Just wear a straight jacket and just sit there and just like, this is what you're supposed to do.
Exactly.
No, it does the opposite. It's like, okay, I know why I fast. Therefore, because I know why I fast, for example, it's to liberate the soul, for example, from the burdens of materialism. You can then go off on a whole exercise around what is the purpose of life, just from that one ritual and that one understanding, which is this idea of being burdened with material weight, right? Which is the soul is eternal, and the idea is the soul is to be free, and the soul has this idea of not wanting material,
transcending the material realm.
So when you can articulate it in that way, and then you can do it through hadith, by the way, as well. You can bring hadiths that say those things, and people are like, oh, I never understood the hadith that way. I just understood the hadith when the devil is being chained up. Right? There's a literal meaning for that, which you can take as valid as well. But if somebody comes to you and says, well, if the devil is chained up, why is he still doing evil? Right? You can still answer those questions in different ways, because you've had a broad understanding of what that hadith and the hadith related to it mean.
One thing that's occurred to me over the years is whether it's time for a fifth madhab, a fifth school of law, or a sixth or a seventh. Meaning, sometimes this four school kind of thing, is it historical accident or divinely, intended? Have we assumed that this needs to be a fixed part of how things are forevermore? If the human race goes on for another few thousand years, is it conceivable that these things remain, if like the basis upon which this tradition continues to evolve? And especially because within each of these schools, there's such a range of this massive diversity, which a lot of people aren't aware of, but is the case. Across them, there's a lot of overlaps sometimes as well. It almost, I don't know how it's helpful, the labeling of these schools as they are after they're kind of, founders. And they weren't really founders, of course, because obviously it's not that they were intending to start them off in that way. It just kind of became that way subsequently. Why is it helpful anymore to have these as reference points? I don't mean particular individuals at particular points in time or particular texts or whatever. But if we're going to do this endeavor seriously in the way that you've been describing and I've been hearing, which is that you actually have like foundational principles that sometimes, you can reassess as well, you can rearticulate, wherever they're drawing from, they may draw from different places. While people criticize that, or traditionalists, quote unquote, criticize that as this kind of pick and mix approach. But at the same time, when these things were happening, they were pick and mixing too. They were drawing on their intuitions and the different things, and a lot of it was just reason, right? Like you said, a humanistic kind of endeavor or project where these things just have come together. Okay, that's my foundations. But then, as we often hear, okay, say Abu Hanifa had a view. Oh, guess what? His two students disagreed on. Okay, well, that's just right at the beginning. I mean, forget now all of the different, all the threads and trends. So I just don't. I am failing to see, especially in the like how it's helpful anymore. It feels divisive, like the labeling of it, the attachments, the groupthink. And it's not, and the problem is that nowadays it's associated, like if you say something like that, then it's associated with, you're not just not interested in scholarship and knowledge, everyone should just go and do a free-for-all. But I'm not saying that at all, right? I think there's maybe a different way, a new pathway, different methods of thinking, especially given the fact that our context, and call it modernity, the current context, the basic elements of current context in which all of this is done has radically shifted, and the pace of change going forward, like what the world is going to look like in 50, 100 years. I mean, you can't even actually imagine right now. It's really hard to see how all of this kind of, let's call it old school, four school stuff still remains like a relevant reference point.
Brilliant question. So, I mean, I can't talk about the other three schools, of course. I'm not trained in them. I mean, I do study them as comparatively. But the one that I have an interest in, so, as you know, the madhahib were more than four, and some became extinct and some became swallowed by others. And there's a whole there's a whole genealogy and study, which is very, very interesting. Maybe that's something that we could look at in terms of why that happened and what can it tell us for today. I think part of the reason madhahib, schools of law, get a bad name is that some of the practitioners are not practitioners of it. They don't understand it well enough. And some have actually taken it down a different path. So I don't want to go down the trajectory too much, but in the last 150 years, there was a big onslaught on the madhahib, as you know, due to destruction of empire and other stuff. And what happened was, there's a word in Latin, I think, it's called mimesis, which is the idea of you mimic your opponents. So Ibn Khaldun has an idea where in his book, the Muqaddamah, he mentions this idea that, when they're vanquished, what happens is to kind of get their level of dignity back, they imitate the one that's conquered them. Right, yeah. So what's happened in some ways is that people who are practicing the madhahib, they fell behind the people who are like the Ahl Hadith movement, people who said we don't need 4 schools, we can just go to Hadith ourselves. In response to that, what's happened is in some quarters is we've started saying, well, here's the Hadith that directly proves our point or our position. But that might have not been the original position, the Hadith that scholars have cited. I mean, I gave examples of how we abstract and we take these ideas, which is actually stronger to me. It makes more sense to me. So historically, we've had that issue. And in the last 100 years or so, there has been a kind of divide between people who say we can just go to Hadith and we can just go to Quran directly, which I think has its place, by the way. I'm not completely saying that it's
but wouldn't you also be simplifying that alternative kind of view to say that that's all that they were doing? Because obviously, in the midst of that, they were and they still are, just as others are, like they're still applying some set of interpretive principles. Of course,
it makes sense. Just think about it for a second. It's just where you it's where you start. It's a question of where you start from. So do you start from the 5th century? Everybody builds on a tradition. It's just a huge. I mean, nobody can say. I mean, when you're saying you're going to, for example, if you're saying you're going to Imam Bukhari, for example, you're still building on a tradition. And when you're engaging with it, you're still reasoning with it in some way, shape, or form. So everybody's building on something. It's just a case of who or what you're doing. So going back to your particular question about the madhahib, I do think that I actually believe, and I'm in agreement with people like Sherman Jackson on this one. I mean, he wrote this in an earlier book on theology, of all places. Yeah, he has a book on Black American Islam or something. I can't remember the title.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant book, by the way.
Yeah.
And he talks about how if the madhahib are fully understood, they can actually be very useful. That doesn't mean you have to be bound to them, because a lot of the madhahib, especially the Hanafi madhab, the predominant one in the UK, a lot of it presupposes you're living in empire. Yeah, it's a fact. I mean, I wrote a paper on this.
Well, some people still think they still are.
Yeah.
In the way they
think in
talk about the world.
They think we're in this abolition. I wrote a paper on this a few years ago about Darul Ulum and Darul Islam and how it implicates. So a lot of the madhab, at least the Hanafi madhab, so when you read things about marriage, it implies there's a judge, who can break the marriage and so forth. But what you can do is you have to know all of that. So sometimes people don't even know that. That's a tragedy. Yeah. That when the scholars are talking about this, they're talking about you living in a normal world, which is Darul Islam, the abode of Islam. There's an imam there. Even the Friday prayers, like the first mas'ala in Friday prayers is like the imam. You can't pray without the imam and the qadi. Like that's the first thing they say about a ritual prayer. Yeah. It's tied to politics. It's actually tied to politics. So you have to be aware of all of that. And then you have to think, okay, well, does that mean we dump the Friday prayer now in London? All the mosques stop praying? No, it means that you kind of think creatively about what that means. Because the Friday prayer has other meanings. The Jum'ah, it's about gathering people together. So you don't get rid of the prayer, but you think about, okay, we know what politically why the prayer was done, but how do we make it relevant today? Yeah. I mean, someone shared a video I did so it was an audio file that I did with somebody about the language of the Friday sermon. And I sent it to someone privately, and they asked me some questions about the language of the Friday sermon based on the Hanafi usul. And they were basically saying, somebody said that the Friday prayer, the khutbah, which are the sermons in 2 parts, they are replicating the 2 units of prayer, the Zohar. They're like badal. Yeah. And I said, when I think through the fiqh of it doesn't make sense to me. Because for prayer, you have to have wudu. You have to have ablution. For the khutbah, it's not a condition. The imam is not facing the qibla. If anything, he's got his back to the qibla. So I'm
that
like,
argument never made sense to me.
so all of these things that people are using, what I'm saying is that you have to think things. And what is a part of it? What is the meaning of khutbah? I mean, we don't. This is a separate conversation, I guess, a longer conversation. And you read other chapters where where they talk about the Friday, the Eid prayer, and there's a discussion about the reasoning, which is to give ta'aleem to people, like to teach people their prayer. Yeah. So I think the mazahib have their use, but we should be creative at the same time. So I give an example, just one example.
But just on that, sorry to interrupt, but like, do we need to be, what I'm trying to understand is, do we need to be creative within whatever the bounds of these individual schools are? Or is there just being creative?
No, it's being creative. You use what's there, what's been given to you, and you think with it.
Yeah.
That's the way I look at it.
And so for the common person now who now asks a question, receives a response, and then wants to know, for example, is this within this school of thought? Is this within that school of thought? The response to that is, well, that's just not valid. I mean, you don't need to ask that question. Is it or is it not?
No. So some people.
Why does someone need to know that?
Yes. So a lot of people want to follow a school because school gives you consistency. It gives you a method. It gives you a method. You can show your workings. Like if I come to a certain ruling, you can say to me.
But is it the school that gives you that, or is it the individual? Because obviously, I can go to 6 different Hanafis. I'm going to get 6 different answers.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I'm not. So then I'm not. It's not the school that's giving me as a common person.
It's their
consistency.
trading of that. It's their
But I'm not getting consistency. It's not the school that's giving them or me consistency. It's if I go to this individual repeatedly, I'm getting consistency.
That's true. I mean, there's a part of it where the school is made of people, and human beings naturally will come to even the same principles. They can still come. It's not exactly mathematical. I can see why people would come to different conclusions based on their understanding of usul or their particular way they approach. Yeah, which is fine. So you would get different positions.
So, but then the idea that there could be a 5th madhab or a 5th school of law or 6th or 7th, or the fact that you could transcend the leaning on particular labeled schools of law and simply just explain the underlying principles, that inform a particular view, right? And then it's called whatever school, or it doesn't need to be called anything.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think,
is that an issue or not?
To me, it's not a big issue. I mean, personally, I think if you follow a school, it gives you a set of principles that you can work with. Because, for example, with my Shafi'i friends, we're going to come to different conclusions because they have a unique set of principles which they've tried and tested over centuries. And they would come to different conclusions in many manner of rituals. What we need to do is train people to also, so that's one aspect, but we also need to train people that it's okay to have a different view on something. Because in some places, it's almost like kufr. It's almost like this imam, he didn't do this after the prayer, or this imam, he's done this, and people like literally repeat their prayers. I've seen people do it. So we need to train people. Part of the issue is that we don't have what I would call tolerance, ambiguity tolerance. There are things that we aren't 100% sure on, but we kind of know it's in this area. And that was pretty much most of Islamic civilization, historically speaking. There were certain things that we knew for certain. Most things we were like, Wallahu alam, God knows best. What we've done in modernity, and even the most religious ones of us have fallen into this idea of positivism, like there has to be one answer. There has to be one position. It's because we've taken a very scientific worldview. Whereas my reading is like, no, there can be different positions. And sometimes even the strongest position might need to drop because it's practically impossible. So, for example, we had this famous case in India where the British were ruling. Because I wrote a paper on Darul Ulum, I was looking into all of this. And it was a Muslim, Darul Islam. Muslims are ruling. Talaq, husband gives it to divorce, for the divorce, but if the wife wants to get out, then she can go to a Muslim judge and he can basically do a khula and he can break the marriage. What the British had done is they'd replace all the judges with non-Muslim judges. Now that creates a problem. Women are stuck in abusive marriages. How on earth are they going to get out of abusive marriages? You can't say, well, tough, you have to stick with him because there's no khula for you because, there's no Muslim judge. Clearly, that goes against the moral principles of Islam, right? And the only way they would then do is get basically become a murtad, leave Islam,
Yeah.
right? Clearly not working. Clearly you can't follow madhab here. So what do the scholars do, or the ones who are a little bit more adventurous, mashallah? What do? They go and ask, well, what are the position in other schools? Right? What are the position in Maliki Mazhab? And then they find a position in Maliki Mazhab that a group of elders can get together and they can break their marriage. So what I'm saying here is that living in this part of the world now, we have these ideas, but clearly, this is why it goes back to my point about you need to know the illah, the reasonings behind these things. You need to know the meanings behind these things. Yeah. Because once you know it's not working, then you can say, well, the fiqh allows us to then say, okay, we need to move to a different position. And there's always been this is one reason why people should read intellectual history, how like rulings change over time. There was a ruling that if you're teaching people the Quran, you can't take money for it. It was ironclad. Like if you read the early scholars, I remember reading in like one text called the Mabsut of Imam Sarakhsi, there was this debate like, not allowed, not going to happen. And then you see over like 2 centuries or a century or so, there's this debate like, okay, actually, if we don't pay these people, who's going to learn the Quran, right? So then the position changes. It doesn't happen instantly, as we'd expect, but it happens over time. They're like, okay, well, because
it just evolves as with everything else. Yeah.
So, but we need to create that space. It goes back to one of my points I said earlier, that one of the challenges is that we don't create that space. It's almost like this is a black and white position, and if anybody says anything different, we're going to write a paper against him or some article against him.
So more open-mindedness.
And people can have debates around it. But we also need to create a Muslim public, or help the Muslim public understand that, and this comes down to people being able to. So when I talk about religious functionaries, right? This comes back to my point about religious function. Religious functionaries shouldn't get into these areas in public. Yeah. They should say, go to the scholar, go to the mufti who's been trained 20 years.
Go to Haroon Sidat.
Yeah, because the imam will tell you if this happens, this is what happens. But when it comes to complicated questions, you should go to someone who's trained, and he'll look at you and he'll say for you, based on your situation in life, this is what you need to do. Yeah. We get questions like this all the time. I mean, I got a question yesterday about a convert to Islam. She'd become Muslim just recently, and she was asking whether she could go for a Christmas party or a Christmas function at her parents' house. Now, clearly, there's not one answer, because she might be a new Muslim. She might be estranged from her
There's
family.
A lot of particulars.
There's lots of like dynamics. So I was like asking the person, well, we need to think about all of these things. But I was like, what are the meanings that we have? She was asking about, when she wants to get married. So in our traditional fiqh, we talk about this idea of a wali, a guardian, right? So like I mentioned earlier on, that in the Hanafi madhab, it's not necessary for a girl, for a certain type, to have a wali. But the scholars also say that so why do we even have a wali then? The hadith talks about wali. So you have to think to yourself, what is the Prophet trying to tell us? It's this idea that the father has the best interest for his daughter. She's going into a new social world, and we need to make sure it plugs in. Yeah. Right? So naturally, we want to do that. So even though the Prophet, peace be upon him, says you don't need to have a wali, the scholars say it's good to have a wali because and then they have a hierarchy. So I was like, okay, how does it work with this convert example? She wants to get married. She's found a lovely man, right? But there are other factors. What if this man is taking advantage of her, right? So then we have to say, well, but none of her parents are Muslim. Yeah. Right. So how do we maintain all of this so we can work out a solution for her that works for her? And that comes from 2 things that you've mentioned, which is that you need to know what the ideal values are that are being said in the text. So you abstract between the lines, but also like the context of what's actually going on. What's the data telling us? What do you know about experiences of converts? Do you go and read some research papers, or you fund research in these areas, and you understand, okay, well, this might be the ideal, but the fiqh is always talking about ideal and normativity, but the realism is this.
Yeah. Okay. We need to finish soon. So quick couple of things. What is the overall summary of what's going on at Cambridge Muslim College? And it's been around for, I think, 15 years or so plus. It was built on the idea to solve a lot of these problems that we've been discussing and to try and move things forward. It seems still one of the relatively unique spaces in the country where this sort of scholarly development or educational processes can be developed in a way that would be more relevant and speak to the times. Has the project succeeded? Is it succeeding, and what's to come?
I think the project has mixed results. We have friends who have done the diploma and come out as sterling students as a result of the diploma. I think we know lots of people who have, and others who may have not so much, but we look at the positives here. I think the landscape's changed as well, Iqbal. I think there was a time when a madrasa graduate didn't have much options, but now they have a lot more options. And a lot of them are more practical about what they want to achieve in life. They have more real life experiences outside of Darul Ulum now. So some of them, we sometimes struggle to get people to come because the Darul Ulum students are sort of aware of other opportunities. So they might want to do a master's at SOAS, for example. I've had students who've done that, or they might want to go and do a degree, because universities are more open to taking people on who might not have conventional education. So it's still an experiment, and maybe we need to rethink about how we can bring the Darul Ulum and the college together. I know they're geographically dispersed, so maybe there needs to be more about bringing the Darul Ulum students in to the college, or college needs to think about how they can take their courses. I know there's this idea of, if they're in Cambridge, they get to experience the culture and the environment, which is actually very, very important. But I think if I was to develop something, if I had ideas, and I'm a big supporter of diploma. I mean, I was the one who pushed for it to be brought back in to the college, and I try and get Darul Ulum students to do the diploma and they take their diploma. If I was to have someone to support me and help me think about it, one of the things I might do is take a more direct path, which is that we focus our energies on maybe taking some of our best graduates, and maybe getting them onto a PhD program, which we fund. And we have Muslims academics who, mashallah, succeeded in this field. And again, university careers are not promising at the moment. University sector is not promising. But if we can fund some of our promising graduates, and we can maybe spread it across the UK, when they do a PhD, we try to get them into a postdoc. They can do research in areas, but also make sure that they've got places in mosques, in communities, or careers. I think that might be a more viable option, because the landscape is continuously changing. The students of knowledge they have more options on the table than they did when I was a student, 10 years ago, when there wasn't much out there. There are universities offering courses where you can come onto a BA program in a second year. There's been talks about trying to do that for the diploma students, and maybe that might be another option as well. So because I think the landscape has changed, we have to sort of evolve. And like most places, like Darul Ulum's, Cambridge Muslim College, I always say they're experiments. We're trying different things. We should always be open to changing things. You know better than me. Things don't work. Try something different. Take on the criticism. Take on the feedback. So we're always doing different things. And I think we should have high standards. I definitely believe that we should expect really high standards, but we should also be compassionate in the way that if they make mistakes, if they make errors, we should kind of understand that actually it's an experiment. But we shouldn't just do things because it sounds nice, but actually we should find a way. And this hasn't been done in for Muslims in Britain, I don't think. This is a final point I really want to make clear, is that a lot of times we think there are problems in the Muslim community, and most of it's anecdotal, and some of it's true. So mental health issues, a lot of it's anecdotal. But has anyone done a study going around the Muslim community in Britain specifically for 3 years or 5 years and said, what are the actual issues? Like what we did with the British Muslim Studies, we actually went down and met imams, we met congregants, we interviewed people, we collected data, and we asked people, what are the issues, what are the challenges, where are the pressure points? I think for the Muslim community, there needs to be some sort of support where we train or get a group of people to actually, and that will inform scholarship. Because if we know, for example, if you, me and you, or somebody else was to come together and say, for 5 years, we're going to go out there and survey the British Muslim community, do some real qualitative analysis, and then based on that, we can then say, okay, these are the issues. These are top 5 issues, Yani. These are top 5 issues that we found. How can we respond to them?
And that brings me to the final question then, which is, what does the future hold for Haroon Sidat? What does the next 5-10 years, if you have life and health, what is it what direction are you going in? Are you going to be continuing in more of this sort of religion, sociology kind of research, and maybe do, further some of this stuff that you've just been speaking of? Or is it going to be more of maybe developing this academy that you've spoken of, getting responses to the people in a way that, sort of makes sense and starts to, I suppose, be at the cutting edge of that call it public intellectualism.
Yeah. So I've come to a crescendo in my life where I think that I need to know the people I'm working with, that I can help, that makes the most impact. So I've done imamat, I've led prayers in a mosque, and I've done a lot of community work, and I'll always be there for them. If they need a khatib, who somebody wants to just listen and rant about, I can just rant for half an hour and people can listen to me, no problem. But I think you need to know the audience. Mine is more of the Muslim thinking crowd, but non-Muslims as well. I've decided that I also want to write and engage with, and write in a way, or express Islam in a way, my faith in a way that actually they can understand. But also to give, I've also found that a lot of Muslims struggle because they don't have a coherent worldview. So a lot of the questions, so I've been gathering questions that I get from all sorts of Muslims, and I've been sort of analyzing the questions, and it's clear to me that it comes from a superficial understanding of their faith, or they're not able to frame their questions in the right way. So it's a very materialistic question. They haven't been taught to think philosophically. Philosophy, by the way, doesn't mean you have to have a degree in it. Like, it's innate. You can think philosophically. So I find a lot of people have these questions, and all it takes is you just kind of, it's like taking a broken clog out, or a misplaced one, and putting the clog in the right place and say, oh, now I know. So what we're doing with the Hujjah Academy, I hope, and we can rebrand it, is that we're trying to get people to really watch our content, engage with us. We're trying to publish articles slowly based on different things that I've been reading. To show Islam is actually a reason revelation, and they work happily together, and there's no sort of like bifurcation, the deen, what we call a deen dunyawi divide, which I don't really think is true. It's an artificial one. So continue research on Muslims in Britain if we're able to do so. That has to be the focus, because for me, Iqbal, this is where we're going to live. This is our country. My children, your children are going to grow up here. We need to focus as much as we can about building for the next 50 to 100 years, doing research, doing work, publishing things that actually help them. You talk about this fifth madhab idea, this idea of like this sort of, how does a madhab, how does it help people today? So my focus is really about when I pass away, whenever it is, I've left some ideas behind. I've left some students behind. I mean, that's why I'm still involved in the Darul Ulum. Ideas, thinking behind that, the students can then take on seriously, to actually make Islam part of what I would call the British landscape. Not alien to the British landscape, but actually it's part of the British landscape. And if we can do that, inshallah, next 50 to 100 years, who knows what will happen.
Cool. No, Dr. Haroon Sidat, really appreciate your time. It's been nice catching up. There's lots of threads of this conversation which, like we've both been sort of indicating, can become sort of separate episodes in their own right. So hopefully, it'd be good to have you back another time if you haven't been too scarred by this experience.
No, you've been easy on me.
I've been easy. Okay.
Thank you so much.
We thought we'd do it gently this time, but no, really appreciate it. And I'll definitely stick all the links, in the relevant place for people to sort of find out more about you and see what you're doing with your academy. Hopefully you get loads and loads of questions and
I hope so.
Followers, maybe some donors as well to support the work.
You never know.
All right, cool. Thanks. Until next time. Take care.
Thank you.